The North Atlantic in winter. A gray swell rolls beneath a sky the color of iron. Spray lifts from the wave crests and freezes before it falls. Somewhere in that emptiness, a longship cuts through the water. 70 feet of oak and pine, its wool sail straining against the wind. On deck, 30 men sit exposed to the cold. There is no cabin or shelter, and no fire. The temperature has dropped to 30 degrees below freezing. Wind strips heat from exposed skin in seconds. Breath rises in white plumes that vanish instantly. Ice crusts the ropes, glazes the oar handles, and forms on the men themselves, on their beards, their eyebrows, the edges of their cloaks. And yet they do not die. For 3 weeks, sometimes longer, Viking crews crossed open ocean in conditions that should have killed them within hours. They did it without fire. No flames for warmth, no hot food, no heated shelter. They relied on human bodies, animal fibers, and a survival system so complete that it replaced combustion with clothing, diet, discipline, and trust. The longship was never designed for comfort. Archaeological excavations of 8 major Viking vessels, from the Gokstad ship in Norway to the Skuldelev wrecks in Denmark, show a consistent design philosophy. These ships were racing shells built for speed and shallow water, with length-to-width ratios of 5:1 or more. The hull planks overlapped in the clinker style and were sealed with tar and animal hair. A single mast carried a large wool sail. The shallow draft let the ship run up rivers and beach directly on shore. What the longship did not provide was protection. There was no deck housing or enclosed compartment below. The space beneath the deck planks, known as the bilge, held ballast and collected seawater that required constant bailing. Functionally, a longship was an oversized canoe. Everyone aboard remained exposed to whatever the sky delivered. This was not an oversight. The absence of shelter was a deliberate choice. Fire aboard a wooden ship coated in pine tar was a constant risk. A single spark in the wrong place could consume the vessel in minutes. Smoke posed another problem. A column of smoke could be seen for miles. For raiders approaching a coastline or crews trying to avoid hostile ships, that column was a beacon giving away their position. Eliminating fire reduced the chance of detection. Fuel added a third constraint. A voyage from Norway to Iceland covered roughly 600 miles of open ocean. Keeping a fire large enough to warm 30 men for 2 to 3 weeks would require a huge quantity of wood or charcoal, space that could instead be used to hold water, food, trade goods, or weapons. By rejecting fire, shipbuilders removed a logistical burden that would have limited their range. The decision was both tactical and practical, shifting the entire problem of thermal survival from the ship to the crew. If the vessel provided no warmth, the men would have to provide it themselves. The first line of defense was wool. Viking clothing followed a layering system that modern cold weather specialists would recognize. Against the skin, men wore wool trousers and an undertunic. Over that, a heavier overtunic or jacket. On top, a thick wool cloak that could double as a blanket. Each layer trapped air, which provided the actual insulation, while the combined thickness slowed the wind. Viking wool itself offered an advantage. Scandinavian sheep breeds of the period produced fleece with unusually high concentrations of lanolin, a waxy substance secreted by the skin. Lanolin is naturally water repellent. Water beads on it instead of soaking through. Women who spun and wove this wool employed methods that preserved the lanolin and tightly locked the fibers together. The fabric resisted wind and continued to insulate even when damp from sweat or spray. This was material science built from experience. No one calculated the thermal conductivity or recorded the chemistry of lanolin. The knowledge lived in the hands of the weavers, in fleece selection, fiber preparation, and loom tension. Generations refined the process until the fabric reached its functional peak. Archaeology backs this up. At Hedeby, a major trading center in what is now northern Germany, excavators discovered textile fragments that incorporated long sheep hairs woven into linings to create dense, insulating surfaces that mimicked the appearance of expensive fur. This fake fur delivered warmth comparable to that of pelts, but used cheaper, more readily available materials. A mitten recovered from the Lendbreen Glacier in Norway, dated to around 1000 AD, shows the same focus on function, a complete sewn garment built specifically for extreme cold. The outermost layer received extra treatment. Cloaks and outer tunics were impregnated with animal fat, usually tallow rendered from cattle or sheep. This coating created a water-shedding surface and stopped spray from soaking into the inner layers. The fat also reduced wind penetration by filling microscopic gaps between fibers. A man in a properly treated cloak carried his own weatherproof shell. Wealthier Vikings took this further. Their outer clothing might be lined with real fur, such as fox, beaver, or seal. A blue fox-lined cape signaled high status and success in raiding or trade. Common sailors rarely had such luxuries, but even they could achieve effective protection with high lanolin wool and fat treatment. The essentials were widely accessible, even if the finest versions were not. Extremities needed special attention. Feet and hands lose heat faster than the core, and frostbite can disable a sailor as effectively as a wound. Vikings used layered solutions. Feet were wrapped in wool or linen cloths called foot sheets, simple rectangles of fabric wound around the foot before it went into a leather shoe. The wraps trapped air and absorbed moisture, while the leather formed an outer barrier. Sewn wool socks served the same role in a more finished form. Mittens like the Lendbreen example protected hands while still allowing a firm grip for rowing and rope work. The wool system was effective, but it had its limitations. No fabric can entirely prevent heat loss in sustained sub-zero conditions. Sooner or later, the body cools faster than clothing can compensate unless the body itself produces more heat. At that point, diet becomes survival technology. Viking sea rations were designed for preservation without refrigeration and to maximize calories in minimal space. Their main protein source was stockfish, cod, or related species that had been gutted and air-dried until rock hard. Properly prepared stockfish could survive for years without spoiling. It did not need cooking, though it was tough to eat. Sailors soaked it or chewed slowly until the fibers softened. Meat came preserved in salt, smoke, or fermented whey. The acidity of sour whey created conditions that slowed bacterial growth, allowing meat to last weeks in barrels. Dairy traveled as skyr, a thick, cultured product similar to yogurt but denser, or as hard cheese that resisted spoilage. All these foods had one key trait: high fat content. Fat powered the system. When the body metabolizes lipids, it produces heat as a byproduct, a process called thermogenesis. A fat-rich diet delivers slow, steady energy that keeps the metabolic furnace burning for hours. The Vikings did not speak in those terms, but they were aware of the pattern. Men who ate enough stayed warm, men who did not become cold and weak. Each meal effectively doubled as a heating event. Without fire to warm them from outside, they heated themselves from within. The body became a furnace burning seal fat, stockfish, and salted meat to generate the thermal energy that clothing alone could not provide. Even this had limits. During sleep, heat production drops. Muscles relax, metabolism slows, and a man sleeping alone in sub-zero cold will cool through the night, even in excellent clothing. By morning, he may not wake. The solution was to sleep together. Communal sleeping on a crowded deck saved more than space. It was thermal engineering. At rest, crews gathered in tight formations, pressing close to reduce the surface area exposed to cold air. Cloaks and blankets were spread across the group, creating a shared insulating layer instead of separate cocoons. Each body added heat to a common pool. Basic physics explains why this worked. A human body loses heat through radiation, convection, and conduction. Radiation escapes from any exposed surface. Convection strips heat when air moves over skin. Conduction transfers warmth to colder materials in direct contact. When 30 men press together under shared coverings, they reduce their collective exposed surface area. Heat radiated by one man is absorbed by another instead of being lost to the air. The group behaves like a single thermal mass that cools far more slowly than an individual. To increase the effect, crews sometimes lowered the sail and draped it over the sleeping formation. The large wool sail, treated with oils and fats, worked as a tent. It trapped exhaled air and rising body vapor, forming a small, warmer, more humid pocket of air under the cloth. Temperatures beneath the sail might hover only slightly above freezing, but that slim margin often separated survival from death. This system demanded trust, sleeping in, physical contact, sharing cloaks, and depending on another man's body heat all required strong social bonds. Viking crews usually had them. They were often kinsmen and neighbors who had trained and raided together for years. To them, the sleeping formation was not a means of intimacy, but rather a standard practice within an existing web of loyalty. Even with all this, the cold remained a constant danger. It waited for any lapse in the system. Archaeology records what happened when the system failed. High mountain passes in Norway have yielded complete, functional clothing sets, wool tunics, cloaks, mittens, abandoned in the snow. The garments show no damage. They were not lost in accidents or stripped from bodies. They were removed by the people who wore them. In the last stages of hypothermia, the body sometimes enters paradoxical undressing. As core temperature drops, blood vessels near the skin can suddenly dilate, flooding frozen extremities with warmer blood. The victim feels an overpowering sensation of heat. In response, they tear off their clothing, exposing themselves to lethal cold. Death follows within minutes. Those intact garments in the snow are physical records of thermal system failure. They demonstrate that the Viking method was demanding rather than comfortable. It required constant vigilance and discipline. A torn cloak, a skipped meal, a night spent apart from the group could start a chain of events that ended in hypothermia. Waking hours brought a different problem: how to stay warm while working. The answer was simple: keep moving. Rowing was both transportation and a heater. Sustained effort generates substantial amounts of metabolic heat, elevating core temperature significantly above resting levels. A rower at a steady pace produces enough heat to offset severe external cold. The oar rhythm, pull, lift, recover, pull, was also a rhythm of survival. This rhythm shaped behavior. Stillness became a threat. During active sailing, there was always work: adjusting rigging, bailing water, repairing gear, and standing watch. Even when tasks were scarce, men moved. They paced the deck, stretched, and rotated positions. Over time, the rule became instinct. To stop moving was to begin cooling, and to begin cooling was to accept risk. At night, before sleep, the crew made final checks. They knocked the frozen spray from the wool before it could melt and soak into the fibers. They ate the remaining rations to feed overnight thermogenesis. They arranged the sleeping formation so the youngest or weakest men lay in the center, where body heat was highest. They set watches to keep someone awake through the dark hours, ready to wake others if the weather shifted or danger appeared. The ship itself had to be protected from the cold. A longship in freezing conditions faced two main material threats: water penetration and ice buildup. Over time, Hull planks allowed some seawater to enter through joints and minor damage. In normal temperatures, this water collected in the bilge and was bailed out. In extremely cold temperatures, bilge water can freeze, expand, and pry planks apart. Ice in the hull could crack timbers and open leaks that no amount of bailing could control. The primary defense was pine tar, produced on an industrial scale. Large earthen kilns throughout Scandinavia processed whole pine stumps at temperatures between 500 and 600 degrees Fahrenheit, yielding 50 to 80 gallons of tar per batch. Applied warm, tar-soaked 5 to 8 millimeters into oak planks, filling spaces between fibers and forming a waterproof barrier. Phenolic compounds in pine tar were antiseptic, slowing rot and deterring shipworms that could tunnel through untreated hulls. A well-tarred longship could stay seaworthy for 30 to 40 years of hard use in the North Atlantic. Crews renewed the treatment regularly, especially before major voyages. The smell of hot pine tar marked a ship preparing for cold waters. Ropes and rigging faced similar risks. Hemp and flax fibers absorb water easily. In freezing weather, that water turns to ice, turning flexible rope into stiff rods. Frozen halyards cannot be adjusted. Frozen sheets cannot be released. A frozen anchor line cannot be paid out. Without flexible rigging, the crew loses control of the sail and much of its ability to respond to wind or threat. Again, the countermeasure was fat. Standing and running rigging received frequent coatings of tallow, fish oil, or pine tar. Sailors worked these substances into the fiber twists by hand. The treatment reduced water absorption by filling internal gaps and helped ropes stay flexible in low temperatures. Lines under heavy use needed frequent reapplication. Rigging maintenance was essential survival work and not optional upkeep. The sail itself needed similar care. A large wool square sail could span several hundred square feet. Left untreated, it would absorb water, freeze, and turn into a rigid board that could not be furled or trimmed. Its weight could destabilize the ship. Oils and fats applied to the fabric slowed water absorption and helped keep the sail workable. Keeping that sail light and adjustable was as important as navigation skill. Cold weather navigation added another layer of complexity. Magnetic compasses did not reach Scandinavia until after the Viking Age. Norse navigators crossed the open ocean using observational methods developed through close attention to the water, sky, and wildlife. They read wave patterns. Ocean swells refract around land masses, changing direction and texture as they pass obstacles. Navigators who knew these patterns could sense unseen islands by the motion under the hull. Intersecting swells at characteristic angles signaled particular coastlines or current boundaries. Clouds and birds added more information. Certain cloud formations rise over land but not over open water. Vertical cumulus built by warm air over land indicated a hidden shoreline. Seabirds pointed toward their nesting grounds or feeding areas. Species, direction of flight, and numbers all carried navigational meaning. In clear weather, celestial cues made everything simpler. At night, the North Star stayed fixed, while other stars rotated around it, providing a stable reference for direction. By day, the sun's path across the sky indicated direction and rough time. Experienced navigators could estimate latitude from the sun's height at noon, using simple tools or their own hands as rough measuring devices. Clear skies, however, were rare in the North Atlantic. Fog, heavy overcast, and long twilight often hid both sun and stars for days. Here, sagas mention a tool, the solar stein, also known as the sunstone. The sunstone was likely calcite, a transparent crystal that polarizes light. Skylight becomes partially polarized as it passes through the atmosphere, and the direction of polarization depends on the sun's position. Human eyes cannot see this directly, but calcite can reveal it. When held toward the sky and rotated, calcite splits light into two beams whose brightness shifts according to the orientation. Navigators looked for the position where both beams appeared equally bright. At that angle, The crystal aligned with the polarization pattern of the sky, and that pattern pointed toward the hidden sun. This was applied physics, derived from observation, not from theory. Vikings did not discuss electromagnetic waves or scattering. They knew that certain crystals allowed them to find the sun through clouds and haze, and they used them. The method was accurate enough to hold course across hundreds of miles, where a few degrees of error could carry a ship past Iceland into empty Arctic waters. Taken together, wool layers, fat-treated outerwear, communal sleeping arrangements, constant movement, preserved rations, ship maintenance, and observational navigation formed a single, integrated system. Each part supported the others. Remove one, and the structure weakened. A poorly clothed man drained heat from his companions at night. A ship with frozen rigging left its crew at the mercy of wind and current. A navigator who lost the sky might lose the ship. The system worked only when every member of the crew did their part. Culture made that possible. Norse mythology prepared men for sustained hardship. Their stories predicted Fimbulwinter, the great winter that would precede Ragnarok, a 3-year period of unbroken cold without summer. This was not just imagery, but rather how they imagined the end of the world. To endure freezing conditions on an open boat was to rehearse for that ultimate test. Their view of fate also shaped behavior. Fate, fixed by the Norns at birth, meant that a man's death came at a set time. Caution could not delay it, and risk could not bring it sooner. This belief did not excuse foolishness, but it made commitment easier. Crews who believed their fates were already woven could face harsh conditions with a steadiness that pure calculation might not sustain. Social structure rewarded the same qualities that cold water voyages required. Successful expeditions brought honor and fame, forms of social capital that translated into influence, marriage prospects, and wealth. Hardship at sea became an investment in status. A man who had crossed to Iceland in winter and returned alive carried visible proof of his worth. This feedback loop reinforced itself. The culture produced men who were ready to undertake extreme voyages. Those voyages created veterans who passed down skills. Each generation refined the techniques, making more ambitious journeys possible. Those journeys earned more status and drew more volunteers. The North Atlantic turned into a proving ground where cold was the main opponent, and victory was measured in miles crossed and men brought home. Other people at the edge of the habitable world developed similar answers. Inuit communities in the Arctic constructed layered clothing systems from various materials, adhering to the same core principles of trapping air, blocking wind, and managing moisture. The Sami of northern Scandinavia developed their own body of knowledge for living in extreme cold. These parallels suggest that the Viking system was not an unusual historical accident, but rather one expression of a small set of solutions allowed by the physics of heat loss. The results speak for themselves. For roughly 3 centuries, Norse ships crossed waters that should have been impassable for open boats without shelter or fire. They reached Iceland, then Greenland, then the coast of North America. They sailed the Baltic, the rivers of Russia, and the Mediterranean, and some served as guards in Constantinople. They did all this in vessels that offered no warmth, no cabins, and no stoves. They managed it by turning the crew into a thermal engine that generated its own heat, maintained its own protection, and navigated by reading the world directly. A longship pulled from a harbor bottom or excavated from a burial mound looks simple. Wood, rope, wool, tar. The simplicity is deceptive. Behind that hull stands an entire survival system encoded in textile craft, food preparation, social habits, maintenance routines, and navigational techniques. The ship was the platform. The system was the crew, trained and organized to endure conditions that would kill an unprepared person in hours. They crossed the frozen sea by simply adapting to it. The fire they lacked was replaced by fat, rich meals, high lanolin wool, disciplined movement, and collective trust. Their warmth came from each other, from the preserved food in their packs, from the work they never stopped doing, and from knowledge accumulated by every sailor who had crossed before. On the coldest nights, when spray froze before it landed and the stars burned in a black sky, 30 men pressed together beneath a lowered sail and waited for dawn. The ship rose and fell with the swell. Ropes creaked, wool held, bodies held. In the morning, they took up their oars and rowed toward a landfall they could not yet see, but trusted was waiting beyond the gray horizon. The ice did not stop them. They had turned themselves into something the ice could not reach.